All right. Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. My name is Troy Langnecht. I work with the Rhode Island Department of Environmental Management in the Bureau of Natural Resources. And I'm joined tonight by Amanda Freitas, also from DEM, who's going to guide us through a presentation tonight. So tonight's meeting is about the 2025 Wildlife Action Plan, which serves as our roadmap for protecting and restoring wildlife populations and the habitats they depend on. This is our third iteration of the plan, and it's due in April of 2026, so coming up. This plan is built on science, collaboration, and most importantly, public input from people like you. So it's really great to have so many folks joining us tonight. We know that you all care deeply about Rhode Island's wildlife, natural habitats, and the future of our state's conservation efforts. So thank you again for taking time out of your evening to be here. Tonight, we will mostly focus on an introduction to the Wildlife Action Plan. What is it? Why do we do it? And where are we in the process? So we'll have an opportunity for questions at the end, but I encourage you to keep tonight's questions more broad about the plan overall, the process, why we do it, what are the implications, or things like that. We are finalizing the draft plan. We're almost there. And once that's ready, we're going to share it with all of you and give opportunity for questions, input, review, feedback. And so that's the perfect time for you all to submit those more specific questions about a particular species, a particular habitat, threats that you're concerned about, things like that. So you'll have that plan in hand and you'll be able to see the details. And so you'll be able to ask more specific questions that way. And Amanda will talk a little bit about that review process later tonight. So for tonight, we're just hoping to sort of give you the background and set you up for that review process and answer those bigger questions about the plan and how it interacts with you and how we're going to get that over the finish line and implement it. So please feel free to drop questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen throughout the presentation, and we'll get to those at the end of the presentation. As I said, this presentation is recorded. We'll post this on the website in a couple of days so that you can come back to it at any time and rewatch. I will also drop the link to our website in the chat. This is a great place to get more information about the plan. We have surveys that you can take about it. Our contact information is up there, and you can also just keep up to date with the plan's progress. So without further ado, I'll hand it off to Amanda.
Thanks, Troy. I want to start by echoing Troy's appreciation that you are all tuned in tonight. A lot of work has gone into this plan, not simply by me by any stretch. The folks from DEM you're going to see tonight on here are the tip of the iceberg, both in and out of DEM of the work that's gone into it. And it just means a ton that people are interested in finding out more about the plan and in wildlife conservation in general. So just thank you very much for being here. I also want to thank the DEM folks who are on the line, and they'll get an introduction later, but I particularly want to thank Troy because she won't thank herself, and she's been enormous to this effort, and also Liam Robenheimer, who's sort of behind the scenes, but he's our swap intern. All along the way, these folks have kind of kept the train on the tracks as we've hit dips and there's just so many moving pieces that I would not have been able to hold it together without them. So just a huge thank you to them as well. As Troy said, my name is Amanda Freitas. I'm the Rhode Island Wildlife Action Plan Community Liaison, and that is a joint project between the Rhode Island Natural History Survey and the Rhode Island DEM's Division of Fish and Wildlife. And what that means is that in between iterations of the Wildlife Action Plan, when we're not in a review cycle, we're in an implementation cycle. And it's my job to be the primary contact to try to get conservation actions on the ground. So again, I'm by no means out here by myself. But if you have questions about the Wildlife Action Plan, if you're interested in partnering, I often say I have no carrots or sticks. So this is really, there's no regulatory component. This is really about finding out where there are shared interests in wildlife conservation, how I can provide technical assistance, where we can partner up, where those opportunities are, what biologists I ought to be connecting you with, all of that kind of thing. And so that is my job, and please do contact me if any of that interests you. So on to the Wildlife Action Plan, and a little bit of background. Prior to the early 2000s, nearly all wildlife funding was allocated to game species. And I'm going to jump back pretty far, but I'll try to do so briefly because I want to provide some context of what that actually means. So when Europeans first came to North America, what they seemingly thought they saw was limitless wildlands and wildlife. And we know sadly that they were wrong about this, and that mistake and that lack of care resulted in some extinctions, and it would have resulted in many more had they continued on the same track. So I'm going to fast forward us to 1937, where this issue is much better understood, and people are trying to get a handle on it and to address it. And Congress and hunters, because take over harvest was by far the biggest issue at the time, got together, and hunters essentially agreed to that they were going to have a tax on guns and ammunitions, on hunting equipment, and that tax would go over to the federal government, but it would come back to the states for conservation to recover these embattled species. And so for what that was designed to do, for the problem of the time, that was enormously successful. But because of the problem it was designed to address, the species that are covered with that funding part are mammals and birds. Again, it was so successful for what it was designed to do that if we fast forward to 1950, similar legislation was passed to address overharvest in our seas. And so that legislation began to tax boating fuel, tackle, fishing equipment, essentially, to address finfish. So now we have mammals, birds, and finfish covered. I'm going to fast forward to 1973, where we get the Endangered Species Act. So the Endangered Species Act does not care if you are a mammal or a turtle or a plant. They're all covered. But the shortcoming of using that funding exclusively is that species have to be essentially in the equivalent of the emergency room before they're on the Endangered Species Act and before they're eligible for that funding. And so that's not a great way to conserve species, to wait until they're in dire straits. And we all know that once you're in the emergency room, things get much more expensive and prospects become a little scarier. And so we have now a bunch of different pieces coming together, but it wasn't until 2000 that Congress passed legislation that would enable the creation of the State and Tribal Wildlife Grants Program. And that program recognized its annual appropriations, and it recognized that essentially now we're to a point where there are a lot of threats facing a lot of different species, and harvest is just one of a lot of them and no longer the primary threat. And so the State and Tribal Wildlife Grants Program allows funding to go towards all species of animals. I want to be clear about that. Plants are still, we've got a ways to go. Plants are still not covered directly. They have to have a nexus to an animal that we're concerned about. So the goal with the State Wildlife Grants Program was to take a proactive approach to conservation by helping species before they become rare, before they're in that emergency room. So what is a wildlife action plan? To receive those state wildlife grants, states have to submit a state wildlife action plan at least once every 10 years. And as Troy said, our first one was submitted in 2005, and that set us up for the cycle of 2015 and now 2025. Our 2015 plan, I think, was actually submitted in March of a little bit into 2015. We got an extension. I think Troy also mentioned that. So our new deadline is April 1st, 2026. So we might be rolling, it's due no later than that, and we're very likely rolling a little bit into 2026 to get this plan completed. And then it's not final until U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service accepts it, approves it. So the plan identifies species of greatest conservation need based on best available data and collective expertise. It also acknowledges when we don't have that expertise. So we're identifying information gaps as well. Species of greatest conservation need are assigned to one or more habitats, and threats to both those species and their habitats are assessed. And then every threat has to have at least one action. So we draw up conservation actions to address those threats. What are the best things we should be doing? The plan also describes relevant monitoring and adaptive management. And there are 8 required elements to a wildlife action plan. I've already just described the first 5. So species, habitats, threats, actions, monitoring, and adaptive management. Those are 1 through 5. and they're really about the content of a plan. The last three are just as important, but they're more about process. So number 6 is review procedures. And that is first and foremost, again, that requirement that plans be reviewed at least every 10 years and then either updated in accordance with the findings, or states would have to say, you know, we looked at it, nothing's changed in 10 years, it's perfect the way it is. That's not what Rhode Island did, but that's an option. The review requirement is there. So how are we going to go about reviewing and meeting those procedures and those requirements? Element 7 is coordination with partners. So in Rhode Island, because we're a small state, because we have a lot of great partners, and because sometimes we lack expertise, our partners are really involved right from the beginning, and then increasingly so as we go along. So we start out this process in 2015 and probably in 2005, definitely in 2025, with assembling taxa teams. So there's a freshwater and anadromous fish team. There's a marine fish team. There's a marine mammals team, a terrestrial mammals team. There's a terrestrial plants team. You get the idea. We go through everything, birds, all of the different taxa that we have any expertise to cover. There is a team, and partners that have expertise that would either complement or fill gaps in our own are on those teams. So already early on, right at the beginning, the Nature Conservancy, Audubon, Roger Williams Park Zoo, URI, PC, I'm going to forget somebody. But anyway, you get the point. We have a lot of partners right from the beginning with actual expertise. I definitely forgot somebody because the plants team had no DM expertise at all. So the vast majority of that team was made up by the grace of the Rhode Island Natural History Survey and the Rhode Island Wild Plant Society on the terrestrial side. And then on the marine side, they did do their own plants. But again, working with partners where we don't have the expertise, and also to help us, you know, to be a check on what we know right from the get. And then once we had an early draft of the plan, which you'll see as a database when it's released, then we invited another over 150 representatives of partners to look at that very first iteration of the database and provide input on whether we got it right. So that was from the beginning of October to the beginning of November, the first week of November. Partners reviewed that database, they provided input. We're in the process of incorporating that to try to really improve the final draft that goes out to the public. And then there's nothing saying that any additional partners, if you're sitting here and you say, hey, I'm a partner, I'm not a public participant, or I have expertise to share. Great, I'm glad you're on the call. There's still time. Anyone can participate in the next release that's going to happen, and we would be happy to have you. So the final element, number 8, is public participation. And that is, you know, for members of the public who have expertise, they are absolutely welcome and encouraged to provide feedback on the content of the plan on those first 5 elements. But it also means that the interested public should just know that we have a wildlife action plan, know where they can find it, know what it's supposed to do, know the content, know where to find us if they have questions or suggestions, and really be able to feel like their voice is heard both in the revision and going forward into the implementation phase. So that's what public participation means. It could be very specific expertise, it could be very broad. So why do we have a wildlife action plan? Alluded to a lot of this stuff. The state wildlife grants require that a wildlife action plan be completed in order to receive the funding, and that funding allows for federal funds to be directed at non-game species that are not covered elsewhere. It also creates a framework to assess species and habitat threats in the state and direct management decisions towards solutions. So prior to 2005, Rhode Island and many states, they may have had a few select species conservation plans, you know, those species that were really hurting or that they had the proper funds to cover. But we didn't really look at the whole ball of wax. We didn't really do this zoom out assessment of everything. And so when we're writing wildlife action plan, when we're doing these assessments, we do not care if a species is hunted or fished. We do not care if it's covered under other funding pots. We look at, does it need conservation attention? And are there actions that can be taken? So those are kind of the biggest things. Should somebody be working on this, regardless of who it is? Should somebody be working on this? Should somebody be trying to help this species? And what are the threats and what are the conservation actions that go with it? So that's, once we have that and we have everything in perspective, then we can start to look more at the details of how we do it, of if we have all the right partners at the table. What funding pots can we use for this? Is this an action that the state should be taking, or is this something we should be, arming the public to be able to do in their own backyards or on their own stoop or whatever it is? So those kinds of decisions are a lot better informed and thoughtful once we've done this big assessment. And then the third thing is that it fosters partnerships from local to regional and increasingly national and international for a comprehensive approach to wildlife conservation. So again, if it's there, you can refer to it, and increasingly every iteration of the plans try to speak better to each other. So these are, we're talking to each other, especially across the Northeast, but also nationwide, so that, if somebody goes into a plan, they know what they're looking at. It has the same basic anatomy. We're speaking the same language. We can look at what needs to be, what is actionable at what scale and how we get that done. So why we need you, again, I said this, but it bears repeating. The Wildlife Action Plan relies on the best available information and expertise from across the state and region to ensure the plan is as accurate and effective as possible. But we need non-expert members of the public as well, because we have, the folks who really know their species and participated in those taxa teams. If they're a researcher, they know where the funding gaps and they're going to try to work on those, and they kind of know what they're doing, and things might change in 10 years, but they're not really the ones who need to keep referring back to the plan. That's sort of me and the rest of us. So if you're a non-expert, and you don't see yourself in this plan, then we have failed, and we need to keep working to find out what we can do that you do see yourself in this plan, because it really is a plan for all Rhode Islanders, and you should be able to either go into the Wildlife Action Plan or go into the tools that go along with the Wildlife Action Plan and see yourself. If you're interested in making a difference for wildlife, you should be able to figure out which actions maybe you could take and what you could be doing. And we're here, but that's what we're looking to get. And so with that comes the distinction between plan revision and implementation. So if you have expertise, then there will be a deadline. We're going to open a public comment period, and we want you to absolutely comment on the plan. But if you have other input to share, if you're interested in partnering, if you think we could be saying something better, or we make a product, you have no idea in 2015 why we even did that, or it could have been better. All of that information, there's no deadline on providing that information, on contacting us and having that conversation. And I'll explain that a little bit more here. So this is Wildlife Action Plan and Wildlife Action Plan informed publications. And the only piece that will be a Wildlife Action Plan publication in 2015 is the piece in the top left. So those in 2015 were fact sheets. You can see this is black eraser, or if it's big enough on your screen, you can see this is black eraser. There's a lovely photo of this beautiful snake. There's a map. There's a little bit of distribution and abundance information. There is some status information, and there are threats and actions for this species. All of these things will remain in the database because they are about content. So they will be part of the Wildlife Action Plan proper. But for anything that was a tool that was developed, and an example is the community guide in the bottom right of the left side of the screen. I think it is on your side as well, on your screen as well. That was part of the Wildlife Action Plan in 2015. We submitted to Fish and Wildlife Service. That one, overwhelmed them, and two, froze that document in time so that it's not a living document. It sat there for 10 years. We're going to decouple anything that we can from what is necessary to go to the Fish and Wildlife Service and what is Wildlife Action Plan content, and then what is a product or tool to help people use it. And that will allow us to, one, not put a deadline on those. People can provide input whenever they want. And two, keep it a living document that we can always be keeping in the back of our minds. Is this serving the purpose we intended it to serve? And how could it be better? And working with would-be users to find out what tools we're missing. So that's a really important distinction that if you go on the Wildlife Action Plan page, and no matter whether you get to the 2015 page right now or the 2025 page, eventually there'll be one, but right now they're separate. You can easily navigate between the two, and these tools on the left-hand side, you know, you're gonna see them somewhere on one of those pages, so you can navigate back and forth. So if you want to provide input on any of those, they are available to do so. I just want to real quick give a nod to all the stuff on the right. These are critter kits, and they're a beautiful example of Wildlife Action Plan informed publications. I can say that because I had nothing to do with creating them. The outreach and education crew did these, and they are essentially portable curricular. They are literal kits that you can check out if you're an educator. So homeschoolers, teachers, librarians, any educators of all stripes can check these out. And there are lesson plans in there. There are hands-on activities, all kinds of, I mean, they're amazing. They really are. You should check them out. But so they're a resource that was, all of them were likely informed by the Wildlife Action Plan, but Liam stuck pollinator pals and scales and slime on this slide specifically because but for state wildlife grants, we wouldn't have those two critter kits, right? They're non-game species. They're not covered under those other pots. They're not all endangered species. And so again, this is something that was enabled by state wildlife grants dollars. And the Herp Observer and the Bee Observer and the biologists behind those citizen science applications all ditto with that. So those are the kinds of things that are being done with Wildlife Action Plan funding. So this is just an overview of the proposed 2025 SGCN. The categories are a tiny bit messy, but I'm not going to go into that. But it's really just, I imagine a lot of you who are engaged enough to be on this webinar have probably looked on the website and seen the draft list and the specific species. But I just wanted to show this and call out a couple of things to kind of be on the lookout for changes from 2025. So I'm going to start with plants. In 2015, the plant list was, because species are not funded, but it was the right thing to do to include a plant list. It was kind of we adopted somebody else's list, essentially. It was a good list, but it was globally and regionally rare species that we didn't necessarily know for sure had ever been here, all of them, and certainly didn't know if they were still here. And so the terrestrial plant team, again, Natural History Survey and Wild Plant Society leading that charge, got together and really looked at the plant list a little more thoroughly, and we have now a more Rhode Island specific plant list. Also, for the first time, plants are assigned their own threats in action. So I'm very excited about that. It is one step closer to treating plants and animals like they're both important for our survival and all of wildlife survival. So that's an exciting development. I just wanted to call to your attention. And we have marine plants for the first time ever. We don't have a lot of them, but we have really critical ones like eelgrass that are just, marine systems are critical to marine systems. And then the marine team went a step further and they named a couple of algae. So that top right algae category, that's all the marine plant team, which is really cool. So we're more and more thinking about the whole ball of wax here. And then on the animal side, we have, I mentioned we look at gaps too. So we have species of greatest conservation need. And in 2015, we named some of them data deficient. So data deficient species are now assessment priority species. And we have, for the first time ever, ants, thanks to Jane Waters. And we have fireflies, which we do not have expertise in-house, but we know we have some idea of like who we should be looking for. And so under the assessment priority, we have added two additional invert categories. So I called out the Black Racer fact sheet, and I mentioned that these would be in the database this time around. Obviously, different species osprey. It's not a new SGCN. It was SGCN in 2015. But just to give you an idea, all of this information, a picture, a map, habitats, threats, actions, that will all be available in the database. And the maps are, but Liam worked really hard on pulling information from the biologists here to redesign the map. So some of them are just stylistically better. All of them have, hopefully, you can let us know. We made a real attempt this time to be more clear in the disclaimers about what these maps do and do not show. So all of the maps, again, stylistically better and a better description of what these are and are not. And then osprey is not an example, I don't believe, but some of them were actually amended. And so the content of the maps. And so the one that comes to mind is freshwater fish. We had potential habitat in 2015. In 2025, we actually have point data where these species were found versus they could be in a cold water stream, but they're not. So if you read the threats, you saw that habitat loss was a threat for osprey. That's going to be the case for so many of our species. And so even if you're only looking at one species, you generally want to also check that species habitat and the threats and actions attached to that habitat. And so for these salt marsh communities, climate change and all of the things you can read here that go with it, major ecosystem changes, including sea level rise, resulting in changes to vegetation communities, changes in temperature and salinity, more frequent severe weather events, and changes in overall habitat suitability. That is one threat tied to salt marsh habitats. There are more in the database that you can check out. And then this is one action tied to that threat to create or really continue to create regulations and policies at state and federal level to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So again, there are multiple actions tied to that threat. That is one of them. So next steps, we want to hear from you. Our database is going to be going live soon, very soon, next week or two, and will be open to the public for review. And so that, again, is going to have those first 5 elements: the species, habitats, threats, actions, and monitoring efforts. And if you have not yet subscribed to alerts, you can email dem.rywap@dem.ri.gov, and that will get you to both Troy and I for the Troy and me for the quickest response. So I just want to say thanks again, and I think I'm going to turn it back over to Troy to moderate us.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to, just bear with me, folks. I'm going to bring in one more person to help us answer questions, but folks, you absolutely at this time can start tossing questions in the Q&A. It's just at the bottom of your screen while we get this other person. Perfect.
So I spoke with one of our participants just before the call, and I thought I had added my phone number here, but I shared the wrong presentation. Not the one that I updated with Troy. So if anyone wants to contact me by phone, my phone number is 401-537-4033. And I'm guessing Troy can maybe pop that in the Q&A as an answer as well.
I can put that somewhere for sure. At some point. I'm going to try to find that and put it in the chat. Okay. So joining us to help answer questions is Phil Edwards. He's our chief of the Division of Fish and Wildlife. So thank you, Phil, for hopping on to help us with questions. We do not, unfortunately, have folks from our marine fisheries crew today or the partner organizations, but Amanda, Phil, and I will do our best to answer your questions. And if there's anything left over, we'll be sure to look into it on the side and get back to you. So our first question from Anne was about the taxa teams. I think we sort of answered this, but her question was, are all the teams DEM employees or are there other partners? So I don't know, Amanda, do you want to sort of talk a little bit more about how those teams were made up?
So the teams were we started by looking at who participated in 2015 and whether they were retirees or not, if they were willing and able to participate again. We have new staff on board. And then we have a lot of great partners with expertise that we either do not have in-house or that those folks provide a sounding board, an additional opinion, professional opinion, eyes and ears on the ground, all of that kind of stuff. And so we have partners who were involved in most, but not all of the taxa teams. The marine folks mostly handled the teams in-house and then extended invitations at the very first partner review for people who had been interested in 2015. So I think that covers it.
Great. We then had a question about marine species, specifically whales, sea turtles, and sort of what staff we have at DEM to address this, and how we're addressing this within the plan. So we did have, like Amanda said, we had a marine fisheries team, but we also had a marine mammal specific team. We do have several whales on the plan. So I think the best thing to do is I'll encourage you to check out the list of SGCN, which is available on our website now. So you can actually see which marine mammals or sea turtles are on that list. And then, like Amanda said, in just a week or two, we should have the full database available, so you'll be able to see the threats and actions that we identify for each of those species. So stay tuned for that.
Yeah, and with all of the there's a lot of things that are deadline oriented and then some that are not, and so it's tricky to juggle all this stuff, but a full list of the taxa teams will be available at some point. But also if you have specific questions, I can direct you to the leads. So there was a reptile and amphibian team, which did include some outside partners. And then, as Troy said, a marine mammal team. So the herps team, the reptile and amphibian team covered the turtles, all turtles.
We have some love for Mary Gannon, who is one of our outreach coordinators within Fish and Wildlife. So somebody, when you put up the critter kits, we got some love for her. So
oh, well deserved.
Yay,
Gabby
Mary. Okay, great. We have a question about greenhouse gases. So you say greenhouse gases are a large reason for sea level rise. What is DEM doing to combat this and, with current administration? So I think that's a huge question. So the example that we gave Osprey, that was just identifying one of the threats. There are several, as Amanda alluded to, and there's several actions to address that one threat. So DEM as a whole has a climate team within our director's office. So we have several staff, both through DEM and also with the Nature Conservancy, which is a huge partner of ours, also on the Wildlife Action Plan. And that team works really hard on regulations, on policies, but also, different pieces of climate change to sort of help address that. So I can maybe actually give you the website for that. I will have to find it, but I will do my best to find it in a timely manner and provide that. Amanda, I don't know if you wanted to chime in on more.
I would just say, I don't know how helpful this is, but I would just say that the Wildlife Action Plan, the biologists and the folks who are putting together these threats and actions, partners and DEM alike, are really just trying to be as scientific and honest as possible about what needs to be done without regard to who the action taker is. And so DEM absolutely is working on this, but even if they weren't, the action would be in there that it needs to be done. Because obviously climate change is just, it's one of the biggest threats, if not the biggest, to all of our species. And so there it is, whether we have the resources or not, and we are tackling it to the best of our ability, I feel like.
Yeah. And that's a good point too, Amanda, that the actions aren't always for DEM, right? Because that action specifically mentioned federal policy, and obviously that's not within our jurisdiction, right? So we identify an action, that doesn't mean that it's necessarily DEM. It might be another partner or a different level of government. Okay, so we have a question about critter kits, which we love. How likely is it that as a result of this plan would be more community engagement, such as critter kits, etc.?
I, so the state wildlife grants, I'm not sure how to answer that, but the state wildlife grants allows, Mary and Gabby to work on those species, like all of the species, not just some of the species, and to be creative about those kinds of projects. And so they're always looking for ways to engage. They are up for ideas and partnerships and things like that. And so whether there are more critter kits coming down the line specifically, I don't know. But I think you can definitely expect more products. And Mary actually is on the outreach team for the wildlife action plan, so that we talk to her anyway, but just making sure that she's the voice at the table to who has more interaction with families, with students, with whoever than I do. And then I believe Troy does to make sure that we're on the right track with some of this stuff.
A great question here. How are members of the Narragansett tribe and other indigenous peoples being engaged in this plan?
So they're a partner, right? They're a sovereign government or a sovereign nation. And so they are not a member of the public. They are a partner. We have reached out to them along the way to update them. We value the relationship with them a lot, and we understand that they have reasons to, maybe be hesitant to participate in government type of things. And so we've tried to be cognizant of that and maintain a very open relationship where we're keeping them updated, whether they're engaged or not, and they are engaged at this point in actual actual review of the plan and letting us know what they think of that. And so we have had conversations back and forth basically along the way.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, a question from Natalie. What are the major changes between the 2015 and 2025 wildlife action plans? Are there any species added to the action plan that weren't in the 2025 version? So we sort of talked about this.
There are definitely species added. It would be very difficult for me to rattle them off to you. Basically, I am unable. I called out a couple in the presentation that we have, I think, 6 ants on there that are assessment priority. We have 1 firefly that ought to be here. I'm not sure we know if it is or not. And some additional bumblebees, solitary bees, plants for sure. And I'm not going to be able to speak to them in any kind of specifics, but definitely we have more marine invertebrates on the plan as well. We have, for charismatic megafauna, fisher, I believe, was added to the list.
Mm-hmm.
There are some species we haven't been concerned about before that we are, and there are species that were on there that maybe don't need as much attention. So there are definitely additions and deletions. And we try to be clear about that, really transparent in the Wildlife Action Plan database. So when it is released and you go in there, everything will be in there. So the 2015 species will be in there, and you'll see that they're proposed for removal if they're not to keep. It's very clear whether they're like, keep this species, this is new, or we're proposing to remove this.
Great. Okay. So somebody asked if we're considering people in terms of access to outdoors and wildlife. So are we thinking about where people are located and where they need wildlife or natural exposure?
That's a great question. One of the products that's been decoupled, or I'm trying to decouple, I think I'm going to be successful in decoupling from from the Wildlife Action Plan proper is our conservation opportunity areas mapping. So that is, we have those species and habitat maps I showed you. But that map is something we want, like when the natural heritage layer is updated, we don't want to be stuck having to submit it to the Fish and Wildlife Service. So I really want that to be kind of a live product as well. And it does not at this point have any cultural component. It doesn't mean it couldn't over time. DEM generally is and needs to be, it's a super agency concerned about people and access and their experience, but also I think it's fair to say Fish and Wildlife are consider it their business to worry about the wildlife more so. So when they do programs, they want people to have a great experience, but their sort of business as a division is to make sure that the wildlife are thriving. And so that's that's something that, because we're a super agency, we're all in the same, not building, but we're all in it together. Those conversations are being had, and I think one of the best things we can do is direct access. So we want people to enjoy nature, we want people to understand nature, so they want to protect it if they have a connection to it, for sure. And one way that we can do that without harming wildlife is be really direct about where access makes sense and where maybe we want a little bit less of it.
Yeah. A couple of more thoughts on that. So our Division of Parks and Recreation, obviously, their main goal, unlike Fish and Wildlife, is for outdoor recreation. So they do a wonderful job at providing opportunities to folks to get outside, guided hikes. They have really cool naturalist stations within a couple of their parks. We also have a land acquisition and conservation team within our Planning and Development Division. So their whole job is to identify new areas that DEM can conserve and protect for public access. So we've definitely got that in other parts of DEM, maybe not in the Wildlife Action Plan.
Some access, I should point out that, well, I'm going to point out while I have the opportunity, is that I talked about that act in 1937, the Pittman-Robertson funds. Land that is conserved with those funds, it is a federal requirement that access be provided for hunting and fishing specifically. Yeah. So depending on the pot of money, certain things are dictated to us, and usually they're a good idea. But we're working with certain restrictions depending on the pot of money that things come out of, or who's in charge, that kind of thing. And so just something to be aware of as well.
Yeah. Okay, we have a question about what actions will DEM take to lobby for funding for implementation of the recommended actions, and how will the funding be distributed, including to academia and supporting organizations?
So I'm an employee of the Rhode Island Natural History Survey. I cannot do any lobbying. DEM cannot do any lobbying, as far as I understand it. So I mean, but there is advocacy, right? And I think like the folks on this call are some of the most important folks, because you can say things we can't say. And so if you feel strongly about something and you see something in the Wildlife Action Plan that's the right thing to do, you can advocate for those things, and you can organize and do those kinds of things. One of the biggest ones that I can involve myself in and try to is working with municipal planners where they have the capacity to deal with me, and to try to get wildlife conservation into long-range comprehensive plans. So that's something that I had worked on a little bit less recently with the revision madness, but to try to, because that's important. Municipalities have a lot of control over how land is developed or not developed and what's protected. And more important than me are citizens of those municipalities to get involved in comprehensive planning and to advocate for wildlife. And that's the community guide that I had up on a slide a while back. A major audience for that is municipal planners and the folks who want to help them and support them to get wildlife in the Wildlife Action Plan. So that's one way that without lobbying, I'm able to advocate for some better policies that protect wildlife.
Yeah, and to sort of tease out maybe more of his question too, he talks about funding for implementation of recommended actions and how will the funding be distributed. So maybe we can talk about, you mentioned that we get the state wildlife grants as a result of participating in this plan. So what's sort of the distribution of the grants that Rhode Island gets? And then how do we decide where that funding goes?
I can't speak to very specifics, but for a pretty long time, Rhode Island has been stalled at. We are a minimum funding state because of our size and the funding calculation. And Rhode Island has been stalled at getting around $500,000 every year. And so that funding goes towards me, the reptile and amphibian biologists, the pollinator entomologists, any of the work that Gabby and Mary do, the outreach crew, Abby as well, do on species that are not funded under other pots. I think I mentioned, yeah, the reptile and amphibian biologists and all of those projects. And so you can imagine that that money goes fairly quickly. I see Phil came on, so I want to see if
Yeah,
he wants
jump
to
in,
chime
Phil.
in there.
Sure, and I'll just add, you did a great job with that, Amanda. I'll add, we have an internal team between the two divisions, Marine and Fish and Wildlife, but there's also a portion of this money is available for competitive grants. So that's where, other groups can apply and try to obtain some of these monies for various research.
Thank you, Phil. Great. Okay. So the next question has a lot about habitat loss. Sorry, it's a long one, so I'm just reading as I go. But it sort of talks about effort being made to work with municipalities that are facing loss of habitat, which you actually happen to talk about, Amanda, with your community guide. Is there coordination being done with these groups that tend to be localized? So I think you did sort of answer this question already. This person in particular is a master gardener, so it sounds like they're really interested in habitat and sort of pollinator pathways. And before I hand it over to you, Amanda, but I'll mention that, as she said, we worked with the Wild Plant Society as well to make our plant list. So that was a great partnership. But Amanda, any more input on the municipality collaboration?
I'm a huge fan of the pollinator pathways. I don't know if the attendees from Barrington, but they have done a phenomenal job of helping that take off and encouraging folks who have the space to really it's just a perfect example of the kind of things that we need to take off and we need people to do, because every little bit helps. So we have in our wildlife action plan mapping, we have cores. We want to like have these big cores and have them be as protected as possible from development and outside threats. But Rhode Island is a very developed state, and so those stepping stones between those cores and between corridors where neighborhoods are just planting native plants are just inordinately important for the base of the food chain. And so thank you for being involved in the pollinator pathway. I sometimes go back and forth between whether something should be like a DEM initiative or we should just jump on somebody else's bandwagon because they're already doing it well. And so in this case, maybe just kudos to the pollinator pathway folks.
Yeah, absolutely.
And we're happy to plug you.
Thank you. We have about 7 minutes left, and I have a lot of questions left. So I'm going to try to sort of get through them quickly. But if there are any questions that are unanswered by 7, we will definitely take those and hopefully be able to get in touch with the folks that ask them and get answers to you. So we have a question: are we going to be sent follow-up emails with the draft plan, due dates, etc.? Yes, absolutely. I believe everybody offered their email address to be here tonight, so we will get in touch with you as soon as that's available. We have a great question. I'm brand new to this. So how is the data collected to determine the list of SGCN?
So we assemble those taxa teams, and in 2025, they had the benefit of all of the 2015 data. And it's a much bigger effort than it sounds for me to say, I just asked them to identify what has changed, but I asked them to identify what has changed. And they are looking at their own observations out in the field from their own surveys. They're coordinating with partners to get that information, what partners are seeing and published literature. And they're literally sitting down in a room and having conversations about what has changed and what they're concerned about, what are new threats, what did they not see coming, 10 years ago. All of that goes into a team's decisions. And then again, there's opportunity for partner review and public review to make sure we got it right.
Yeah, great. We had a question about outreach for high schoolers. So I just dropped in the link to our wildlife outreach program. So check that out. And you all should be able to see the answered questions. I hope that is the case. Our next question is, are there species in the action plan that are specific to East Providence, East Bay? Again, once the draft plan comes out, you'll be able to see maps with every single SGCN. So you'll be able to see the distribution of each species and sort of where they fall within the state. Okay. We have a question about prescribed burning. So will prescribed burn data be included as it pertains to new habitat and or species that are sort of there because of the burning, or maybe also I'm going to add, or because they are reliant on such habitat?
So that's sort of a we're working on it kind of thing. We are trying to get better information about the goal is to get better survey, like actual survey of what happens after a burn. We don't have that capacity at the moment. And it would be, I think, not in Fish and Wildlife, but out of forestry to do that work. But it is something that we're really looking to do. I had something else and I lost it.
I was thinking of, we do have some habitats that call out that they're fire dependent, right? Did I make that up?
No, we definitely have species and habitats that are fire dependent, and the focus tends to be on those. There are, forestry and the fire program has other concerns like human safety. It's a big ball of wax, but definitely habitat is part and parcel of that. And it's complicated because we should be able to burn in places that are meant to burn. But because we've gotten to a point where habitats and sometimes like plant populations that are hosts for a rare species are now so dwindled that we really have to have hard and very precise conversations about what should burn and when, to make sure that we're not, that we're having a benefit and we're not having any kind of detrimental impacts to species that we're trying to help. Basically, they need the burn, but we still have to be careful because there's not many of them left in some cases.
I'm just sort of scanning the questions to try and get the broader questions to answer now for everyone. And then, like I said, we'll answer others afterwards. So we do have a question about another gardener, which is wonderful. They're doing their best to encourage clients to like leave the leaves and other things like that, but they want to do more. So where do they look for ideas? I will shoot the link again to our website, maybe to the 2015 plan, so that you can find that community guide. That's a great resource, the one that Amanda talked about earlier, but also that wildlife outreach programs link that I dropped earlier. That will be a great resource too, because that has all sorts of pamphlets and downloadable information that you could use and share with folks.
Yeah, I think, and again, pollinator pathways do a good job of this. I think as long as you're getting your information from a reliable regional source, so that you have the right, you're talking about the right plants and the right pollinators, I think that is, you can go to other sources besides us, but I'm more than happy to connect on this. I'm actually on the board of the Wild Plant Society too, and so this is like a personal passion of mine. So I'm happy to connect on that and try to provide more information. But I think one of the big things we can do is have poster children. This species needs this plant, make those connections that it's that it can be that specific the way that folks have done with milkweed, because there are plenty of other species besides monarch and milkweed. And I remember the other thing I wanted to say about fire. The wildlife action plan is not, because it's a broad point. It's a pretty broad plan, and so there is the conservation opportunities areas map in terms of like where we want to be very intentional about conservation, but it doesn't really get into spatial specifics about where we want to manage. That's a more in the weeds than the wildlife action plan itself.
Yes, and we'll use that as our last question, because there were a couple specific questions about like is this specific habitat being analyzed, or are there any lands that have growing wildlife or areas that are designated as pristine? And it's takes a different track, the wildlife action plan, in sort of identifying habitats that are key to our species. And so we do show a distribution of those habitats across the state, but it's not necessarily calling out a specific property. It's just highlighting the habitat that is essential to our SGCN, and then threats to those habitats.
I think it's safe to say that nothing we have is pristine, but we have, the best of the best. And I think that's actually what Rick Enter called it when he went out many, many moons ago and tried to look at across all of our habitats. He's no longer with the state, but very important naturalist. Went out and looked at all of the habitats across the state and tried to identify and map, what are the best examples of these habitats across the state. We haven't done that in a while, but we do still have that data, and some of them are, in protected lands where we're doing our best to keep them as pristine as possible.
Absolutely. Okay, it is 7:01. I don't want to take up more of folks' evenings. We do have a couple questions left, and we'll do our best to get back to you offline. So thank you all again so much for joining us tonight and giving us some of your time on this Wednesday evening. And we hope that you'll stay engaged, visit our website, send us questions, and definitely review that plan once it becomes available. Any other thoughts, Amanda, before we go?
Just thanks again for tuning in, and feel free to reach out.
Absolutely. All right. Take care, everyone. Have a great night.